Sometimes we can get the sense that living in a country where we have quite good social support mechanisms in place, we can assume sometimes that that was the way it has always been. And that that's not really one of the characteristics of being a Christian society, to support those who are in difficult situations. However, we know that things were not always the case as they are today. And the Acts of the Apostles gives us some description of this today as to how the early Christian community lived together. People became believers very quickly after the resurrection. After the days of Pentecost, the Christian community grows very, very quickly. And within not too long a period of time, persecution started to happen. Certain people started to lose their jobs. Certain people were isolated. And so the early Christian communities lived together. They would, as we're told here in the Acts of the Apostles, they would sell their property and they would bring the proceeds of their property to the community, to the church. And the church would then do what it could to support those who were vulnerable amongst the community. This was the first time you see this starting to occur in this structured way in the world. The Romans didn't do this. The Greeks didn't do this. Even the Jewish communities weren't known for doing this either. They would give handouts at times, but to actually have a pool of where people bring their resources together and then assist those who are vulnerable. This was one of the characteristics of the early church Christians. And this has become quite standard and quite normal right across the world to say, if someone's lost their job, that we shouldn't just say, well, bad luck, you're on your own. If someone has been persecuted or isolated, we don't just say, well, bad luck. But as a Christian community, we know that Christ calls us to be people of love, especially for the poorest of the poor. Pope Francis has talked about this very often, that as a community we need to go out to help the poorest of the poor, to be not just a church that's inward looking, we're called to go out to the margins, to where there are most challenges, and to bring Christ there. And that's not just primarily a financial thing. And what the Acts of the Apostles were talking about in our passage, the first reading today, wasn't primarily about finances. It wasn't about primarily of selling property. This was about a community that recognised the dignity of each person, that built each person up, and that worked together in being that presence of Christ in the world. We're called to be missionaries like this today as well. If we have some resources, we shouldn't just be inward looking, not just in the moment, but even just right across our entire life, and even what we do, even in death. How do we use those resources to build up and to serve the church and help the church to be able to then serve the poorest of the poor? It's one of the challenges at the moment. The church is not gathering in the same way that we do normally. But that doesn't mean that we're not called to still do what the Acts of the Apostles were doing. If there are vulnerable amongst you, bring some of those resources that you have, bring that to the community, and the community can help to bring assistance to others. This is what the early church community were doing, and this is what was one of the great characteristics of Christianity. Many governments have taken on support like this because of the way of the Christian spirit that was there in the early Christians. Let us treasure this support that we have for others, that we work together to build up the vulnerable, to build up dignity, to build up that love of the human being so that we can help others to grow in that love for God. And then from there, they can grow in a love for each other as well. Let us be the community, like the early church community, that recognises and does what they can to help the dignity of every person.